Hello dear students and welcome back to this History Prelims Revision series. If you are new over here, then let me tell you that we are running this series specially keeping in mind the upcoming prelims on Sunday, where I take up curated high ROI topics for revision. In the first two episodes of this series, we have covered key terms from ancient and medieval India. You can click on the playlist link to watch the earlier videos if you have not watched them. In today's video, I'm going to take an important topic, which is colonial acts, that is pre-independence acts. A lot of you students find them difficult to remember, and therefore in this lecture, I'm trying to not only provide their significance and provisions, but also contextualize them so that it will be easier for you to remember. In case you're wondering how you can get updates about my videos and PDFs, then here is my Telegram channel, Jawwad Kazi UPSC Preparation. You can join my channel using this link, or you can scan this QR code to join it and get latest updates. Well, with that out of the way, let us now get down to the task. First, before I start discussion about the important acts, I want to show you a couple of questions that were asked in PYQs in the previous years. Take a look at this one question. Consider the following statements about Charter Act of 1813. So UPSC directly asks questions based on these acts that were passed during the colonial times. And there are some acts which are really very favorite of UPSC. Charter Act 1813 is definitely a key area for us. Three statements are given over here. It ended the trade monopoly of EIC, East India Company, in India, except for trade in tea and trade with China. That is the statement number one. Statement number two, it asserted the sovereignty of British Crown over Indian territories held by the East India Company. And third statement, the revenues of India were now controlled by the British Parliament. These were the three statements that were given. The first statement is obviously right, and I'm sure every UPSC aspirant worth his salt knows this. If you know it, then you can easily eliminate answer option B. Second, it asserted the sovereignty of British Crown over the Indian territories. The statement is also right. So answer option C also gets eliminated. You are left with two options, A and D. The third statement, that is revenues of India were now controlled by the British Parliament. That is an incorrect statement because East India Company in the first place needed finances. The court of directors, the shareholders, they had invested money. So at this stage, that was not the case. So statement 3 was not right, and that gives you the answer option A. If you're able to eliminate two options, then you are in that zone of taking risk. You will have to take calculated risks. There will be hardly 40 odd questions in the prelims about which you will be very sure. The remaining questions, to increase your marks, you will have to use elimination, application, and somehow arrive at the answers. So calculated risks are part of the game. So this is one example of colonial acts based questions. Let's take one more example now. What was or were the objects of Queen Victoria's Proclamation of 1858? I'm including this as a part of act because it is coming in that same sequence or series. To disclaim any intention to annex Indian states, to place the Indian administration under the British Crown, and to regulate East India Company. To regulate East India Company's trade with India. So again, any UPSC aspirant worth his salt would know that the third statement is wrong because 1858 is when the curtains finally come down on East India Company's rule and the crown takes over. So the third statement is wrong and the other two are right. In any case, if you're sure about 3 being wrong, then 2 options are eliminated. And consciously, you have to try to eliminate answer options to double check. UPSC knows what you know and what you don't know. And therefore, the answer options are designed in such a manner that you will be tricked. So it's always a good practice. Make it a SOP for yourself that you eliminate the answer options even if you're very sure about the answer. That will double check and prevent you from making what you call as silly mistakes. Okay. So these are a couple of examples that I can cite. Now there are many more examples. In part 2 of this video, I will take more examples, but now let's get down to the real business. The acts that were passed during the British times can be divided into two parts. The first part is the company period, starting from 1773 Regulation Act right up to 1858. That's when the company rule ends. So that is the first phase of these acts. The second phase is from Crown's period till the end, that is 1858 se lekar ke 1947. That period is the Crown's period. So we can have a segregation based on these time periods. Now, if we go a little into details, what is the nature of the acts passed in this period? We get some common features. Please remember, guys, when you start to memorize or mug up facts of history without contextualizing them, then the facts become very volatile. You easily forget those facts. But if you root them in the context, then you are able to remember that for a very long time. So let us have a context of this period. During this phase, that is the company's phase, what is the trend that we see? Trend number one is increasing centralization. Now, as you know, company was able to win Bengal first. That was their big victory. And therefore, presidency of Calcutta became very important. Governor of Bengal was called as Governor General of Bengal very soon. Why? Because Calcutta is the core, the kernel of East India Company's rule in India, Bengal area. Okay. So what we see is during this phase, the company phase, there is centralization towards Bengal. That is key trend number one. Second, we start to see crystallization of structures. We'll see some institution building. We'll see some delineation of structures. For example, Supreme Court comes about. For example, Law Commission is created. What are we seeing? These are all creation of structures. So remember that centralization, structurization. Third, slowly reducing control of the company. Now, as we advance from year to year, the company's control starts to loosen and the control of the British government, the parliament, starts to increase slowly, steadily, and the final flourish will come after revolt of 1857. So remember this point, losing control of company is the third trend. And the corollary of that is increasing control of British government. They are two sides of the same coin. So remember these 3 points for the company period. What are the important acts in this phase? Act number 1, Regulating Act of 1773, Pitt's India Act of 1784, and then we have some charter acts. 2 of them are important, 1813, 1833. 53 is relatively not that significant. And finally, Government of India Act of 1858. So these are some of the acts that we must know about. Okay. Now let's see the subsequent phase of these colonial acts. This is the Crown's period. Trends over here, obviously the first thing is complete control or takeover by the British Crown. Slowly, steadily, we see legislative devolution starts. Slowly, Indians are nominated, then indirectly elected, then election systems come about, Congress ministries will be formed in 1930s, so on and so forth. So slowly, steadily, that legislative devolution process starts from this phase, starting very initially in 1861 itself. Third, increasing representation. More and more sections will start to find representation in the process. Second, so devolution, representation going on increasing. Third, we see many characteristic features of the Indian polity evolving through this process. Many of the features that we have inherited, that we continue with, have been shaped through this process. What are these features? For example, federal structure. You see concepts like diarchy. In 1935, we have a system or idea called as federation. So what is happening over here? The federal structure is starting to shape up in India. A unique brand of federalism, which is Indian federalism, not like America. Then idea of distribution of subjects. We have union list, state list, concurrent list. All of that is a consequence of this process. Then establishment of Public Service Commission and some other bodies. That also starts during this phase. Distinction between executive and legislature. Two separate aspects. Executive is different from the legislature. Judiciary already was separate, but this separation also is going to sharpen in this process. So these are some of the trends that we see in the Crown period. What are the acts that we must know about? Council Acts of 1861, Council Acts of 1892, very important, Government of India Act of 1909, the most important Government of India Act of 1919, what we call as Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. So Morley Minto and Montagu-Chelmsford are very important, more so Montagu-Chelmsford. Then Government of India Act of 1935, this is also very important. And obviously last, the Independence of India Act 1947. These three are most important. This is like a sandwich, burger, whatever you would like to call it. Okay. The middle part is what is most significant. If you see PYQs, most questions have been asked over here. So be very thorough with Government of India Act of 1919. Chaliye, now let's see some 18th and 19th century developments regarding acts. Okay. Now, the trend of UPSC asking questions is higher in the 20th century measures, but nevertheless, we have to revise and prepare these also very well. So let us first talk about the Regulating Act of 1773. Now, any act, when you want to remember its provisions, it is very crucial that you understand the context in which it has come about. So what is the context of this Act of 1773? Let us note that first. Background, company at this point of time was no more a mere commercial entity. See, 1599 company is created, then 1600 it gets a charter, 1609 the company's representatives come to the Mughal court. Throughout this phase of history, the company is basically a trading entity. But after defeating the Nawab of Bengal 1757 in Battle of Plassey, and then 1764 in Battle of Buxar, the nature of the company changes completely. 1765, a very important development takes place. The Treaty of Allahabad is signed between the East India Company and the Mughal king. And why did this Treaty of Allahabad, East India Company is going to get Diwani rights of Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. So now it is no more just a trading entity. Therefore, this changed the nature of East India Company in India, required a changed relationship with the home government. And therefore, this act is passed, which is called as Regulating Act, very fittingly. So they want to do regulation of East India Company, which originally was supposed to be just a trading entity, but incidentally has become a political power, and therefore a new law is required for it. That's why Regulating Act comes about. Okay. Now this company had Diwani rights. Diwani means revenue collection rights in Bengal, Bihar and Orissa. From 1765 to 1772, this East India Company implements a form of government which is called as dual government. In this dual government, all the powers are with the company, but the responsibilities are with the Nawab. This was the brainchild of that devil-minded person, Robert Clive. Dual government, 1765 to 72. Now, this necessitated a different relationship with the mother country. Okay. So, I hope you are able to see the changed context. Now, it is my conscious endeavor, guys, that while we discuss these acts, wherever possible, I also try to revise the peripheral important points. Okay. So, that's why I am touching upon other aspects also. In Britain, there was tremendous resentment against East India Company. Now, remember, guys, this is the phase where Europe is in, it is dominated by the idea of mercantilism. Okay. Mercantilism is the ideology of indulging in trade for maximizing profit for the home country. And in this endeavor, in mercantilism, monopoly was the instrument that was considered most suitable. So monopoly is used instead of competition in mercantilism. But as we approach the end of 18th century, ideas start to change. People start to question the concepts of mercantilism and monopoly. There is a lot of envy for the exclusive right that East India Company had amongst ruling circles of England. So this required a changed relationship vis-a-vis East India Company and the government. Next background important point is bankruptcy of East India Company. Yes, you may be surprised that East India Company, which was defeating Indian powers as if they were just, those 9 pins on the bowling row, that same East India Company was facing a massive financial crisis. Its officials had amassed a lot of wealth, they had become rich, but the company was going bankrupt. Why was that so? Number one, wars in South India. Wars with Tipu Sultan, wars with the Marathas, all of that had taken a big toll on the East India Company's coffers. Second, the famine in Bengal had created a lot of crises regarding revenue. They had acquired the power for revenue, but then famine had created a lot of practical challenges. And third, the higher dividends that was being paid to the shareholders of the company. All of this combined together to make the company bankrupt. A special act was passed. On a side note, I'm mentioning this. In 1772, a special act was passed which was called as the Tea Act. This Tea Act gave East India Company monopoly to trade in tea across the British Empire. Only EIC could do that. Why was this done? To save it from this dire financial condition. So the British government realized that now they have to step in and do something about this company which has created a lot of mess for them. So they want to regulate it now. Okay? That is why the Regulating Act is brought about. This Regulating Act will lay the foundation of centralized administration for Britishers in India. Okay? Now let us see what were the key provisions. Now that you have understood the backdrop, the provisions will become relatively easier for you to remember. Governor of Bengal was now made Governor General of Bengal. Now, why this glorified kind of a status, Governor General of Bengal? That is to underline the fact that the Governor of Bengal is at a higher pedestal as compared to the other two governors. Bengal is the center of gravity of East India Company's rule in India, and therefore the Governor of Bengal has an elevated status. He is now referred to as Governor General of Bengal. So can you see that trend of centralization that I spoke about earlier towards Bengal? This is very visible here. Second, Bombay and Madras were subordinated in matters of treaties and wars. Now, before this act came about, these two areas, Bombay and Madras, vis-a-vis Bengal, they were all like acting rather independently. Yes, they were part of that same company, but then the distance was so huge, coordination was so difficult, and in those days, means of communication were very, very, they were not so advanced. That is why there was a need felt that we need to have some kind of a structure. And therefore, Bengal is made the paramount amongst these three presidencies. So Madras and Bombay, they have to be completely subordinated in treaties and war to Bengal so that there is coordination amongst these three. A Supreme Court was now established at Calcutta. Now, why do we need to establish a Supreme Court at Calcutta? The reason being there were a lot of Europeans who were living there in the British colonies, British areas, And because of that, there was a need for dispensing justice. Now, they could not be given justice on the basis of Indian laws. Warren Hastings and the most important early Governor General, he had created a structure for judicial system. But then the Europeans could not be subjected to Indian laws, and therefore there was a need felt for a parallel system, and hence Supreme Court was created at Calcutta. This would try cases involving the Europeans. Officials of the company were forbidden from accepting bribes and gifts from Indians. The officials of East India Company were not paid very well, and therefore they were always on a lookout for opportunities to quickly gain through bribes and gifts. And to control this, they were forbidden from doing so in this very act itself. Okay, so these are the key provisions regarding Regulating Act of 1773. How is this act important? I told you, trend of centralization is visible. It starts the interference of British Parliament in India. Third, it recognized the new status of East India Company. From being a purely commercial trading entity with its own army, now it had become a de facto, de jure political power. So these are the significances of this act. Now, there were some limitations though. The Governor General and his council, which was supposed to have Governor General plus 4 members, this council always saw a lot of conflict within. Warren Hastings could never really come to terms with the other members of this council, and constantly there was bickering going on. That is why this act became difficult to implement. Taking decisions was a big task for this council. Second, unclear jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. Now, the court was created, but then there was still confusion regarding which specific areas the court will actually look into. So there was lack of clarity regarding Supreme Court's role. Thirdly, it did not impact the functioning of the company in England as such. Whatever is happening in India. But then the headquarters of the company is there, the shareholders, the court of directors, everything is there in England. The structure, the systems over there had not been affected by the Regulating Act. Because of these limitations, the next act will have to be passed. Okay? In history, everything is connected with the thing to follow. It's like a chain of events. So if you understand one thoroughly, then you are able to understand the next one also in a better way. Let us see now the next act, which is Pitt's India Act. Background of this is the weaknesses of the earlier Act of 1773, as we just saw. Despite all the efforts, the finances of the company were in doldrums. And this was a big concern for the British government. The company was supposed to pay an annual amount to the British government in return of the monopoly that it had. But the company's finances were so bad that they were not able to pay back that amount, and this created a big question mark on the idea of monopoly itself. So there was need for reform. Third, the inefficiency of Madras Presidency. As I mentioned earlier, these 3 presidencies were virtually acting independently earlier, and they were waging wars on their own self. Madras was in conflict with Tipu Sultan at that point of time, Hyder Ali and his son Tipu Sultan. And because of those wars, Madras was financially bleeding. Carnatic wars also with the French and their Indian allies had taken a big toll on the economic well-being of the company. In this context, the British government decided that we need to reform this, and the Pitt's India Act is passed for that reason. Pitt was the name of the British Prime Minister, and that is why the act is known after his name. Now, what did this act do? So, the earlier act was focusing on India alone. Now, they are trying to tweak certain things in London. Hence, a new body is created to watch over East India Company. The Parliament does not meet every day, and it is not possible for the entire parliament to have an oversight over East India Company. So they need a structure in between. Just like we have different committees in our parliament, similarly here, a special body is created called as Board of Control, which will have 6 parliamentary commissioners. What will their role be? This board will have complete control on civil, military and revenue affairs of East India Company. All the 3 matters: civil, military and revenue. The Court of Directors. Now, who are the Court of Directors? Let's understand that first. Court of Directors was the elected body of the shareholders of East India Company. There were numerous shareholders in that joint stock company. Now, not every shareholder can come practically and run the company. It's neither practically possible nor advisable. Therefore, a representative body is elected. That body is called as Court of Directors. This Court of Directors was now supposed to comply with the order of Board of Control. So, parliamentary oversight has been strengthened on East India Company, not just in India, but also in Britain. The Council of Governor General, which was earlier having 4 members, was now reduced to Governor General plus 3. Warren Hastings kept on writing letters after letters complaining about these 4 fellows who don't allow him to work, so to speak. And finally, the British government relented and the number was brought down to 3. Nevertheless, Warren Hastings decided that he will resign and we will have a new Governor General of Bengal from this point onwards. Control of Bengal over Madras and Bombay was further strengthened. So the trend of centralization continues. Madras and Bombay are constantly being brought under Bengal. Okay? These are the provisions of Pitt's India Act. Now let us see the significance of this act. See, why am I talking about significances also, limitations as well? Because statement-based questions are created from such things. It is not sufficient to just know the provisions in the form of facts. It is important to contextualize, important to understand the significance, the limitations also. So what is the significance? Number 1, now we have dual control. On one hand, there is Board of Control, which is representing the British Parliament. And secondly, we have the Court of Directors, which is representing the company. Okay. Further, British parliamentary control is now strengthened vis-a-vis earlier act. More interference by British Parliament. Centralizing of British authority. We see that trend continuously. Bengal getting more and more power. Governor General's position is improved because now the council has 3 members and not 4 members. So even if he has 1 vote with him in the total council, then he can carry the day with him because he has the casting vote. Civil and military organizations or civil and military government of the company was subordinated to the British government completely. So long story short, Pitt's India Act basically increases centralization, improves the power of Governor General and brings about civil and military control of the British Parliament. Now let's see the next act. So we have seen 2 acts, Regulating Act and Pitt's India Act. Let's see the next act, which is a very important one, Charter Act of 1813. Backdrop of this act is Wellesley's long wars in India. Which Wellesley is it? There were 2 Wellesleys and UPSC confused you the last time. The guy who was the Governor General, his name was Richard Wellesley. And he had a younger brother. His name was Arthur Wellesley. Richard Wellesley had taken several measures, including establishing a training institution for British civil servants in India. UPSC had confused you with the name of his younger brother, Arthur Wellesley. Arthur Wellesley went on to become an even more illustrious Briton. He is known as the Duke of Wellington, who defeated Napoleon in the Battle of Waterloo. Later, Arthur also became the Prime Minister of Britain and he is regarded as one of the greatest British person, ever. But anyways, that's a different story. So Richard Wellesley, he had waged long wars with many Indian powers. It was during his time that Tipu Sultan was finally defeated. It was during his time that the Maratha War took place. It was during his time that many other Indian princes were also facing pressure from East India Company. He used to call himself the Royal Bengal Tiger, a very narcissistic person perhaps, but nevertheless he has left a very huge impact. So Wellesley's long wars had created financial burden for East India Company. Second was Napoleon's continental system. Napoleon had dominated all of Europe. Entire West Europe was under his control, and Russia was its good friend at that point. Now Napoleon wanted to crush Britain, but naval terms it was not possible for him to go and defeat the British Navy. So what he did, he implemented this system which is called as the continental system. In this system, long story short, Napoleon cut off British trade with Europe. Britain's economic jugular vein was its trade. And cutting off its trade meant bringing Britain down to its knees without fighting it. That was a brilliant idea by Napoleon, but practically very difficult to implement. For 4 years, from 1806 to 1810, this system was implemented by Napoleon, leading to a lot of losses to British trade. And please remember, this is the time when Britain's industrial revolution is really picking up. And therefore, this was a very opportune moment for Napoleon as well. Third, Committee of House of Commons had given certain recommendations for changes in relations with East India Company. So in this context, a new act is brought about, Charter Act of 1830. Now, what is meant by Charter Act? Charter Act basically was like a right that was given to East India Company, which was periodically reviewed. The first charter was given sometime in 1600, and then every few decades it was reviewed. In the 19th century, in 1813, then 20 years later, 33, and then 1853, we have successive charter acts coming about. Charter Act 1813 abolished the monopoly of East India Company. I hope you remember, monopoly is a concept very crucial to idea of mercantilism. By the time 19th century comes about, what has happened is that Adam Smith and his ideas have become immensely popular. And therefore, the concept of giving monopoly to one company is being excessively and harshly criticized. So Charter Act abolishes this monopoly except in two things: trade in tea and trade with China. 1 and 2. Apart from this, there is no exclusivity for EIC. Any Englishman could trade with India. There was no limitation now. Rules and procedures for using Indian revenue were also laid out under this act. What the East India Company can and cannot do. Because left to themselves, they used to pay a lot of dividends to their shareholders. And that meant a lot of pain for the company itself. 1 lakh rupees was kept aside for literature and education. This is the first time that the British government was acknowledging that they have some development related responsibility also. So in the act, 1 lakh rupee was specifically to be kept aside for this purpose, literature and education. But practically speaking, nothing of that sort happened is a different story. It was only a hollow promise that was made. Now let's take the next act, Charter Act of 1833. The decade of 1820s and the early part of 1830s is a very remarkable period in the history of Britain. In this period, we see the idea of liberalism. The idea of liberalism becomes dominant in Britain's, national, you can say, discourse. And because of this idea of liberalism becoming dominant, we see that many progressive steps and measures are taken. And that finds its reflection in India in the form of this Charter Act. Let us understand a little bit more about this. Backdrop of this act, need for administrative consolidation. Now the British rule was firmly established. Tipu Sultan had been finished long ago. Marathas had been humbled. All other Indian powers were either subordinate allies, or they were not in any position to challenge the Britishers. And therefore, administrative consolidation became an important priority for them. In Britain, the Reform Act was passed in 1832. This is a very landmark act in Britain, which increased the participation of the people in democracy. Reform Act of 1832. This is again inspired from idea of liberalism. Now there were increasing demands that Crown should take over in case of India. The East India Company's rule should come to an end. Now, in this context, we are going to see what are the measures of this act, Charter Act of 1813. Provisions. Company was now to be administered only on behalf of the Crown. So it was like a final warning to East India Company that your time has now come to an end. It's only a matter of time before you will have to fold up and leave this place bag and baggage. Monopolies, whatever remained, were also abolished. So now no exclusive monopoly for China, no exclusive monopoly for tea also. Monopolies are gone. Laws of Governor Generals were now to become acts, not regulations. Earlier they were referred to as regulations. Now they are called as acts. See consolidation, see centralization, you can see it affecting here. Governor General of Bengal now became Governor General of India. Now, having defeated all the major Indian powers, it was logical for them, from their perspective, to consider that they are here to rule this subcontinent and they can legitimately call themselves as, rulers, and Governor General could be called as Governor General of India. Madras and Bombay now lost their legislative powers also. In that increasing centralization, Madras and Bombay were stripped of their legislative powers as well. Fourth member was now again added to the Governor General's Council. Now this is a bit tricky, but let me make it as simple as possible. The first Act, Regulating Act, brought in 4 members. Then Pitt's India Act brought it down to 3. And then again in this Act, we see it coming back to 4. This 4th member was called as the Law Member. Thomas Babington Macaulay, or Lord Macaulay, he was the 4th member, the first person to be appointed to that position, 4th member of the council. And he also headed the Law Commission for British India. The role of this Law Commission was to design a penal code for the country. By the way, Lord Macaulay was also made the head for deciding the system of education in India, and he came out with that famous Education Minute in 1835, which decided the type of education that Britishers will provide in India. That's a very significant development in our history, particularly in area of education. The company was enjoined to improve the condition of slaves and abolish slavery. 1830s, early 30s, I think it is 1833 to be precise, slavery was abolished across British colonies, and here East India Company was also expected to do the same. Several steps were taken for centralization of the rule in India and ultimately liquidation of company's rule. So these are the measures of Charter Act of 1833. Let's see now Government of India Act of 1858. Now, as I told you earlier, Charter Act of 1853 doesn't have any major significant provision, so question is rather unlikely. Government of India Act of 1858 comes obviously in the backdrop of revolt of 1857. This revolt came like a big jolt. East India Company or the Britishers did not expect that Indians will rise up in such huge numbers and give such a big shock to their rule in India. And therefore, it led to a lot of introspection on their part. Secondly, there was already tremendous demand for ending the dual control that Pitt's India Act had brought. You remember there were two bodies controlling East India Company over here. One was the Board of Control and second was the Court of Directors. So two entities were controlling the entire structure in India. So there was demand to end this dual control. Both the parties, Whigs, who are Conservative Party, and Tories there, they wanted transfer of power from company to crown. Crown should completely take up. So all of these factors led to the passing of Government of India Act 1858. Now let us see some major provisions of this act. Crown took over complete formal control of rule in India. East India Company's rule was abolished. And with it, the dual control also comes to an end. So now there's no company, means no control of Court of Directors, and that Board of Control is also gone. So no dual control. Instead, we have one official called as Secretary of State. This Secretary of State was a member of British Cabinet who was responsible to British government. Responsible to whom? Directly British government. And he was supposed to provide an annual report on progress of India. So every year he was presenting a report to the British government, which was in any case not taken very seriously. To aid and advise this person, Secretary of State, a Council of India was created. Council of India to aid and advise the Secretary of State. Governor General now got an additional title of Viceroy. Vice means deputy and Roy is a root word for royal over here. So Viceroy means deputy royal. He is representing the crown here in India. So two positions, so to speak, Governor General and Viceroy, and both the positions are actually occupied by the same person. Now let us know about or read about the Queen's Proclamation, about which UPSC had asked a question. Canning became the first Viceroy of India. He was the Governor General at the time of revolt. Dalhousie leaves in 1856, and all of that mess that was created, the incoming Viceroy Canning had to handle that in the very next year. Policy of extension was now abolished. Now, sometimes you might have wondered why there were so many princely states in India at the time of independence. The reason behind that is Queen's Proclamation. Via this proclamation, the Britishers assured the Indian princes that there will be no further extension or annexation of Indian rulers' territories. And that's how the princely states came to stay right up to the time of independence. Services in India were now, at least theoretically, for the sake of saying, thrown open to all the subjects of the Queen. Nobody will be debarred was the idea based on religion, race, caste, etc. Britishers promised to follow a policy of religious neutrality. There was a lot of discontent in Indians because of interference in matters of religion. The socio-religious reform movements was seen as being abetted by the Britishers. You know the famous episode of cartridge cases being made of fats of cows and pigs. So that made Indians very angry. Britishers realized that Indians are very sensitive about matters of religion and therefore they promised neutrality in this aspect. Policy of respect for ancient rites, usages and customs. Whatever traditional practices Indians had, those would be respected is what the Britishers are promising here. The bone of contention here was the practice of adopting sons by rulers. The doctrine of lapse of Dalhousie had prohibited these kind of adoptions. And that had led to a lot of discontent, and we know how Rani of Jhansi had fought in the revolt of 1857 this being her primary, grudge. So for this reason, such ancient practices and usages were to be respected. So these were the provisions regarding the Queen's Proclamation immediately after the revolt of 1857. On that note, guys, I will conclude this particular session over here. In part 2 of this lecture, we are going to cover the acts that were passed subsequently, starting with Council of India Act 1861 right up to Independence of India Act 1947. I'll see you in my next video. Thank you very much.